Should the UFC re-sign Muhammad Mokaev?
Muhammad the Punisher Mokaev! Would you say your relationship now with the UFC is stronger than it was 2 years ago?
I think it's much better. It's much better than it was. I changed totally, like even my lifestyle, everything, many things changed. I'm 25 now. I cannot blame and say I'm 21, young, stupid. No, like I'm old and I have to be responsible for my own things.
And it is time for Dana White and the UFC to re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. It's not even a want at this point, it's a need for the UFC flyweight division.
This is the real deal. Fingers crossed, he'll be back in the UFC next year.
Recently, there's been a lot of rumors about the UFC potentially re-signing Muhammad Mokaev. But although a lot of fans don't want to see the UFC re-sign this guy, I'm here to tell you the UFC should indeed re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. But quickly, before we get the video started, my name is JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, as only 10% of you watching are actually subscribed. And also, if you guys want to support the channel even more, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, best bets, discounted merch, and additional perks as well. And of course, this all starts at just 99 cents. But anyways, let's get into it. When you go around and ask different MMA fans what's their biggest issue with the UFC, it can range into a lot of different issues. Whether they talk about fighter pay, whether they talk about the apex, whether they talk about additional issues as well. There's so many different things that MMA fans dislike about the UFC. But another issue that a lot of MMA fans bring up is the lack of consistency within the cards. Because typically when you talk about towards the end of the year, the pay-per-views and fight nights, they're usually really high level. When you talk about the cards in November and December, they're always amazing. The main events are amazing, the main cards are amazing, and honestly, usually the prelims are even amazing as well. But when you talk about cards earlier on in the year or in the middle of the year, a lot of times those cards don't turn out to be that great, whether you talk about pay-per-views or whether you talk about fight nights. And the excuse that a lot of fans use for the UFC a lot of the time is the UFC doesn't have a good enough roster in order to put on great cards each and every week, or mostly each and every week. Now, in my opinion, I think this argument is invalid. I think when you currently take a look at the UFC's roster, they have a ton of amazing fighters within their company. And I think if these fighters actually stayed active, we would be able to see cards, great cards, throughout the entirety of the year. But with that being said, I think an additional solution to this is to add additional talent to the roster. So when I started to hear rumors of the UFC potentially re-signing Muhammad Mokaev to the flyweight division, I was all for it. But a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, why do I think the UFC should re-sign Mokaev? Well, in my opinion, this comes down to a couple different factors, but the first and main factor comes down to his skill level. Because when you talk about Muhammad Mokaev, he has the ability to do a lot of different things. And when you talk about the flyweight division, that is something that you need to have. On the feet, Mokaev isn't necessarily the best striker in the world, but he definitely has an ability to strike, and he's shown that outside of the UFC, alongside within the UFC as well. Now, obviously, his grappling is his main ability, and he does a really good job at utilizing it. He does a great job at taking down a lot of his opponents, and on the ground he can go to submissions, he can go to ground and pound shots. Essentially on the ground, Muhammad Mokaev is more than competent, and we've seen that once again within the UFC alongside with outside of the UFC as well. So at this point, I think it's very clear that Muhammad Mokaev is UFC level, as of course he was previously in the UFC and had a lot of success, and even on top of that, in his fights outside of the UFC, he's looked extremely impressive. And as I mentioned before, the more UFC caliber fighters you can add to the roster, the better the overall product would be. Now, the next reason for why I think the UFC should re-sign Muhammad Mokaev is due to the current champion, at least at the time of recording the video, which is Alexandre Pantoja. And when you talk about Pantoja, he's been incredibly dominant. And when you talk about a lot of the contenders at the flyweight division, they're mostly guys that Pantoja has already beaten once or possibly even twice in the past. So adding an additional potential contender like Muhammad Mokaev would be an overall benefit benefit for the division and for the sport as a whole. And also, when you talk about stylistically what Mokaev can do, I think he poses a very different threat to Pantoja. Because for the most part, when you talk about a lot of these contenders, yes, on the feet, they could have success against Pantoja, but usually once Pantoja finds that first takedown, it is over. And a lot of times he is able to find submission victories. But when you talk about Mokaev, he poses a very different threat, as theoretically he could even be offensive with his takedowns, which would be a huge change for Pantoja. But even if Pantoja was able to find a takedown on Mokaev, it wouldn't automatically be over. Mokaev obviously has a lot of skill on the ground. He can avoid submissions, he can go for his own submissions, and it would be a very different fight as compared to what Pantoja is used to for the most part. So not necessarily saying Mokaev would beat Pantoja, but at the very least he would be a different contender that Pantoja has never fought against, for one, but for two, it would be a very different stylistic threat for Pantoja. So in my opinion, for those couple reasons alone, I think the addition of Muhammad Mokaev would be an overall positive one. Now, the next reason for why I think the UFC should re-sign Muhammad Mokaev actually comes down to a business reason. Because initially when Mokaev was cut by the UFC, he was saying that he was willing to fight for the UFC for free, or fight for the UFC on a very cheap contract.
Of course, I said to Hunter Campbell, I said, whatever I've done at the hotel, I'm ready to pay for that and fight next fight in UFC for free. Whatever trouble I made.
So theoretically, if that were to still be the case and the UFC didn't need to pay Mokaev that much to re-sign him, I think it would be a really good low risk, high reward sort of scenario. Because as I said before, Mokaev definitely has the possibility of being a top 5 flyweight, or potentially even a guy that contends for the belt. So if you get a guy with that potential and you don't need to pay him all that much, I think it would be a win-win for both sides. And I'm not necessarily advocating for the UFC to pay their fighters less, but the only reason for why I'm even bringing that up as a point in this specific scenario is I do think this could be a great way to convince Dana White and the UFC to actually re-sign Mokaev. And going forward from there, if Mokaev does turn out to be a champion, or if Mokaev does turn out to be a top 5 fighter, obviously at that point he would have a lot more leverage in order to increase his contract. So overall, I think there's a lot of reasons for why the UFC should re-sign Muhammad Mokaev. But another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, if the UFC does indeed re-sign him, how well do I think he would do in the UFC? Well, in my opinion, I think Mokaev is at the very least clearly good enough to become a ranked contender, and more likely he would even be a top 10, top 7 type contender in the flyweight division. But with all that being said, my opinion differs from the public sentiment. At this point, a lot of fans are thinking that Muhammad Mokaev would be the champion, or he would be a clear top 5 contender, and maybe eventually he does get to that point. But based upon what I've seen from him in the UFC, and even some of his fights outside of the UFC, I don't necessarily think he's good enough to beat some of the highest level of competition at the flyweight division. Like, for example, I don't know if he's good enough to beat a guy like Joshua Van. I don't know if he's good enough to beat a guy like Brandon Moreno. I don't know if he's good enough to beat a guy like Tetsuya Taira that could potentially cancel out his grappling. There's a few guys at the top half of the flyweight division that I think stylistically could be really difficult matchups for a fighter like Muhammad Mokaev. And of course, all that is not to mention the current champion, at least at the time of recording this video, Alexandre Pantoja. I don't think Pantoja would be a walk in the park either for Muhammad Mokaev, and I think that fight could be maybe even a little bit of a more difficult stylistic matchup for Mokaev. So overall, I do think Mokaev is a really talented fighter. I definitely think he is clearly UFC caliber. I even think there are a lot of guys in the rankings that he could beat. But when you talk about the top level, the top echelon of fighters, I'm not necessarily sure or sold that he would be able to compete, or at the very least beat those sort of fighters. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening with Mokaev, whether or not he does get re-signed by the UFC, and if he does get re-signed, how much success he would have within the UFC. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the UFC should re-sign Muhammad Mokaev, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.